Seasonic, the heart of your system.
Hi guys, it's Silas from Kit Guru, and today I'll be taking a look at a pretty funky looking cooler from Deepcool, the Gamerstorm FRYZEN CPU cooler. Now to start with, it's a bit of a funny name, but as you can imagine, one of the main draws for the FRYZEN cooler is that it supports not only most AMD mounts, but also Ryzen Threadripper's TR4 socket. Along with the TR4 socket support, for £89.99, the FRYZEN cooler also offers pretty unique aesthetics, along with a full host of addressable RGB LEDs, both built into the cooler and the included fan. The lighting is rated to support most software packs like Asus Aorus Sync, ASRock's Polychrome Sync, Gigabyte's RGB Fusion, and MSI Mystic lighting. It's not a massive cooler when you compare it to, say, a dual tower, dual fan air cooler, but it is still rated for up to 250 watts. So it'll be interesting to see how it performs in our testing. Interestingly, to get into the FRYZEN cooler's box, you have to pull away a pre-cut cardboard tab. This did strike me as a bit novel, but was a bit irritating actually when I started to tear up the box. Not a massive problem, but it did make me cry a little inside when the box looked a bit of a wreck after opening it. In the box we find the cooler itself and instructions for both cooler installation and of course for all the lighting connections. A large accessories box with mounting hardware for, again, most AMD mounts and including the TR4 socket, and a whole host of cables as well. Some thermal compound and a wrench are also included, which will likely be required for installation. The cooler itself feels nice and solid, no issues there, and this includes even the pre-installed fan. The pre-installed 120mm fan features plastic blades, but a heavyweight aluminium ring frame. The cooler only really features plastic on the very top LED cover, which gives the FRYZEN cooler a very dense, weighty feel, and at 1.19 kilograms, it certainly doesn't feel cheap. Looking over the build, the fan does appear to be a standalone unit, something that could, say, be mounted to a PC case, but it's also heavily built into the cooler. It doesn't strike me that this is intended to be swapped out. There are a few points at which you could start to take the cooler apart and remove the fan, but as this isn't stated on Deepcool's website or in the instructions, I felt it would be safer not to attempt this and ensure the cooler was still functional for testing, but your mileage of course may vary. As the FRYZEN cooler features a number of RGB LEDs, there are of course cables that need to be connected. On the cooler itself you have a standalone 3-pin cable for LEDs at the very top of the cooler, and a second for the LEDs for the fan. The fan is also a 4-pin PWM model, so you can also expect a cable for connecting to your CPU motherboard header. Included with the cooler are a number of extra cables for the inbuilt RGB lighting. You get a couple of expansion cables for connecting up extra LED strips or LED fans, which is really nice to see, as well as 2 adapter cables for connecting the FRYZEN to your motherboard's LED header. A small inline controller is also included, which is great, allowing you to configure your lighting even if your motherboard doesn't support an addressable RGB LED header. Initially a bit daunting to see so many cables, but realistically you will only be using 1 or 2, so it's nice to see that Deepcool have basically included everything you might need to guarantee compatibility. For installation, we do get to delve a bit deeper into the included mounting hardware. You do get a backplate and a number of parts for sockets like AM4 and AM3, but for us, these of course weren't required. For TR4, you start with the 4 double-threaded standoffs which need to be screwed into the socket mounts. With these in place, there are 2 larger brackets which need to be placed above and below the socket. Conveniently, these are identical and also feature little arrows on the top to direct their orientation during installation. These 2 brackets can then be bolted down using the 4 smaller thumb nuts. You can then apply your thermal paste and mount the cooler atop your CPU. There is a large bracket pre-installed which passes through the centre of the cooler, so it's just a case of lining up the 2 screws with the holes on the now installed brackets. The wrench I mentioned earlier can come into play here, but in all honesty this was far too fiddly, so I decided to employ a screwdriver instead. The mounting screws are for a Phillips head screwdriver, and using one really speeds up the installation process. With the cooler mounted, you just need to connect the 2 3-pin RGB cables up. I use the included controller for this, that also requires a SATA power connection, and then the 4-pin PWM cable can be connected to your motherboard's CPU fan header. All in all, a pretty easy process which only took around about 10 minutes or so. What's awesome to see as well is that the cooler being quite narrow, even with the installed fan, there is full clearance for installing RAM, even higher profile. The cooler doesn't overhang any of the memory slots, so there are really no issues with clearance whatsoever. With the cooler installed and ready to go, it's on to testing. As the FRYZEN cooler is basically designed for Threadripper, although it includes mounts for other AMD sockets, we elected to stick with TR4. For CPU, we are testing with the AMD Ryzen Threadripper 1950X, a 16-core 32-thread beast, installed in a Gigabyte X399 Aorus Gaming 7 motherboard. For RAM, we're using a 32GB kit of G-Skill Flare X running at 3200MHz, and storage is handled by a 120GB Samsung 840 EVO SSD. Powering our bench is a Seasonic Prime Platinum 650W PSU, and purely to enable a display output, an Nvidia Geforce GTX 980 was also installed. For testing, we run a number of tests, both with the 1950X locked in at 3.4 GHz and overclocked on all cores to 4 GHz with a core voltage of 1.4 volts to generate kind of a worst case temperature scenario. As the 1950X is not really an optimal CPU for gaming, we elected to run Prime 95 to establish a highest possible temperature at both 3.4 and 4 GHz. And as the 1950X is suited to more productivity-based applications, passes of both Cinebench and Blender's BMW CPU benchmark were run to give a better idea of temperatures during typical use. All temperatures taken are delta T values, which means that we subtract the ambient temperature from the CPU temperature. More details on our full testing methodology can be found over on kitguru.net. So, on to the results. Starting with Prime 95, for a single 120mm cooler, it actually keeps things relatively cool even with our 1950X overclocked to 4 GHz. 65.5 degrees being pretty reasonable even when compared to, say, the Dark Rock Pro TR4 tested on the same setup previously. Idle temperatures for both 3.4 and 4 GHz don't get beyond 8 degrees, and at 3.5 GHz at max load, it's only a few degrees behind the Dark Rock Pro TR4. For Cinebench, we had to run a number of passes to ensure temperature stabilised, as the multi-core test absolutely flies by, but temperatures for both single and multi-core still look promising with a max of 59.6 degrees at 4 GHz. Single-core tests only really designed to give you an idea of temperatures when not utilising the full 32 threads of the 1950X, but still looking good at under 30 degrees. For Blender, it's as we'd expect, basically sitting in between both Prime and Cinebench in terms of temperatures. At 4 GHz, the 1950X hit 64 degrees, so a little below our Prime testing and about 4 degrees hotter than Cinebench. At stock, temperatures were actually a tiny bit lower than both Cinebench and Prime, but a much better representation of temperatures when rendering, say, for instance. Audible noise, however, was a little bit louder, which for a single 120mm fan cooler is kind of to be expected. The included fan running at a full speed of 1800 RPM was a little bit louder than, say, the Dark Rock Pro TR4, which tops out at 1500 RPM. The 51.7 dBA recorded wasn't exactly unbearable though. Kind of the trade-off you make when using a smaller cooler with just the one fan. Still achieving good temperatures, but sacrificing audible noise a little. Taking a look at the included lighting, it actually looks pretty spectacular. Colours transition between each other really smoothly, and even from the top of the cooler into the fan. There are enough LEDs to light up the cooler, but it's not overpowering, and I did find it look best in a darkened room. The simple controller works really well and gives you access to a bunch of different effects and colour transitions. In total, you get a full 36 different options to choose from, split into 5 effect groups. Deepcool described them as dynamic, static, breathing, comet, and fashion collision. I personally found some of the cooler effects to be simple transitions from one colour to another. The colours picked are very complementary and shouldn't have any trouble matching the rest of your system. And at the end of the day, you do always have the option of discarding the controller entirely and connecting directly to your motherboard, enabling you to sync your lighting as well. So to summarise, the FRYZEN cooler is a bit of an interesting one. For starters, it's really well built and feels super solid and premium, even down to the fan's construction, which favours aluminium over a standard plastic frame. It's also nice to see a bit more varied compatibility with mounting options for older AMD sockets as well, as a number of TR4 compatible air coolers are basically only compatible with the TR4 socket. Aesthetically, I think it looks pretty good, and the inbuilt lighting also pretty awesome, without looking tacky or, say, over the top. Really, the only area the FRYZEN cooler falls a little bit short is in performance when compared to much bigger, heavier dual-fan coolers. In this area, you are sacrificing a little audible noise as well. Whether the Deepcool Gamerstorm FRYZEN cooler is right for you really depends on your preferences. If you're not super fussed about RGB lighting and having your system look a little bit bling, then it's probably not the cooler for you. This being said, if you are looking for an air cooler for your Threadripper system and would like a bit more pizzazz, the FRYZEN is a unique and pretty wowing option, which for £89.99 will still keep your CPU in check. So make sure to leave a like or a dislike or even a comment down below just to let us know what you think. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't already, and feel free to click the bell icon below as well if you would like updates on new video releases from Kit Guru. I've been Silas from Kit Guru, and I will see you in the next one.